Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. So today, it is my Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, on Comic Book Wednesday, I talk about a different Marvel Epic collection, and Steve Donoghue on his channel talks about that same Epic collection and gives his thoughts on it. It is our world's finest team-up that happens once a week. So this week, I'm going to be talking about the X-Men once again. I'm going to be talking about this volume. This is X-Men Lonely Are the Hunted. This is volume 2 of the X-Men and the X-Men Epic collections. This has X-Men issues 24 through 45. Also has Avengers number 53 and Not Brand Ek number 4 and number 8. A couple humor. That's a humor title, not Brand X, so a couple humorous additions to this Epic collection here. And frankly, this Epic collection needs all the help it can get, so that's fair. So, I am reading every issue of the X-Men. Month and a half, something like that ago, I accepted my own challenge, a read every issue of challenge. I spun a wheel to see which Marvel comic book I would read every issue of, and the X-Men won. So I'm reading every issue of the X-Men. Slowly. Unfortunately, I've been pretty busy over here at Stately Vaughan Manor. But I am reading every issue. And so I'm going to be talking about these issues that I read in this Epic collection. So at this point, the X-Men are not at their best. That is just a fact, unfortunately. A lot of this is not great, but there are some things of interest. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot of it. The stories were mostly written by Roy Thomas and, was it Friedrich? Let me check. Gary Friedrich and Roy Thomas were the writers. Some of the stories were good, some not so good. The most interesting stories in this were actually some backup features that they started doing, which were about the origins of some of these characters. You had the origin of Cyclops and how he first met Professor X and that kind of stuff. And that was interesting because that had some of the stuff in here that was interesting, which is how the mutants are hated and feared by normal people. And that stuff is interesting. A lot of this stuff wasn't that interesting. Roy Thomas, he still was kind of sounding a little bit like Stan Lee and a little bit like Roy Thomas. Not as good as the stuff he would come out with later. Definitely not up to par with his Conan stuff, that is for sure. But I think when he took over this title, Stan Lee was like, okay, do it this way. And he was trying to do it that way for a while. But a little bit of Roy Thomas comes through in here. A lot of the stories aren't bad, they're just not great. Nothing stand out, I don't think, with most of the stories. Like I said, some of those backup stories were pretty good. Probably the thing most worth talking about in this Epic collection is an artist by the name of Werner Roth, who has worked throughout this Epic collection. He did a lot of the issues in the front half of this collection, and then eventually the X-Men started doing a main feature and a backup feature, and the backup feature were centered on an individual X-Men and his origins. And those were, for the most part, illustrated by Werner Roth. And they would get other artists to do the main feature, which was a mistake, as it turns out. So Werner Roth, mostly known up to this point for Lorna the Jungle Girl, and he did some Western stories, which I'm blanking out on. Can't really remember. But that's the kind of stuff that he was known for, and that's the kind of stuff, frankly, that he was good at. He wasn't a natural for a superhero story, you know, or a really big deal epic superhero story, which the X-Men kind of were pushing for at times. That wasn't his wheelhouse, but this was his assignment. And he wasn't the natural talent, Werner Roth, that, say, Jack Kirby was. Jack Kirby could kind of phone it in now and again, and still be good. or at least interesting. Jack Kirby had action scenes beyond compare. He had a natural talent that just shone through even when he wasn't doing his best work, or even when he was rushing. Werner Roth didn't have that natural talent, I don't think. Well, I know he didn't, just from looking at his work. He didn't even have the natural talent that Steve Ditko had, although Steve Ditko was a lot worse when he phoned it in. Werner Roth did most of the artwork in this book. These are some of the earlier stories that Werner Roth did when they were fighting the Locust. So it's not bad. It's not bad work. But it doesn't have that kind of dynamic style that you're used to when you're looking at Jack Kirby's work. So this is the first time I've read any of the stories in this book. I didn't start reading the X-Men really until after Chris Claremont had taken over in '75, and it was the new team with Wolverine, and Storm and all those guys. That's the X-Men that I was familiar with. Up to this point, I had only read the first 10 issues of the old X-Men, which I read in a Marvel Masterworks edition. I got all these epic collections, but just hadn't read them yet. X-Men was kind of like the blind spot in my Marvel reading, which is why when I did get the X-Men as my spin, I was kind of excited because I knew I was going to be reading a bunch of stuff I had never seen. So I had never seen this stuff by Werner Roth. I'd never seen any of these issues. And Werner Roth, like I said, he doesn't grab you when you first look at his stuff. But I noticed something interesting about his work as I was reading along. And Werner Roth turned out to be, probably for me, the most interesting part of this epic collection. And the thing that's interesting to me about him is that he was given this assignment to do the X-Men, and it wasn't his natural thing, I don't think. But while he might not have been the natural artist that a Jack Kirby was, or even a Steve Ditko, Werner Roth worked hard. He didn't rush. He didn't phone it in. He spent time, as much time as he had. They were all working quickly, but you could tell that he spent time to give his best work. Nothing is rushed. It all has a degree of polish to it. And even though the figures could be stiff, not all compositions are fantastic, he did spend time to do his best work. So you've got some dramatic scenes. You've got some interesting perspectives in this book. Some of this work actually turns out to be pretty good. And that I found interesting. And so as I was reading along, Werner Roth turned out to be kind of the saving grace of this epic collection. You have a couple interesting perspectives there. That's a pretty good scene right there. So I was kind of getting to like Werner Roth in this book. There's the Banshee. Now Banshee becomes kind of an important character later on, and he gives Banshee really an interesting look in this first appearance of Banshee. I'm pretty sure this had to have been the first appearance of the Banshee. It sure seemed like it. And he also did an interesting job with his characters. You can see there that he gives his characters pretty good facial expressions, and he also gives them all a unique look. He took the time to do that kind of thing, and when it came to two characters talking or interacting, he was really good. He did a really good job with this kind of stuff. I get the feeling that kind of stuff was what he was a natural at. And maybe the action-y stuff he had to work a little harder at. But still, he had some pretty cool moments in this book. So I appreciate that Werner Roth gave it his all. He might have been given an assignment that wasn't the best for him, but he did the best with what he had, with the ability that he had. He gave it his all, which I appreciate. And like I said, his stuff is pretty good. Later on in the Epic Collection, we start jumping around from artist to artist, and that isn't so good. We have one really good issue in here from Dan Adkins, who's normally an inker. He did this issue here. What issue is this? 34. And he gives all the characters a really interesting look. I think Dan Adkins probably did the best work in this whole issue, just on this whole Epic Collection, just in this one issue. He actually did a pretty good job. Just really good stuff, quality stuff in this one story. But then we jump to, we get Werner Roth again for a while, but then we jump to things like Ross Andrew. Yeah, this has got to be Ross Andrew, right? Yeah, Ross Andrew did this stuff. And it just sort of starts looking really substandard. Really just not that great. Don Heck jumps on here, and Don Heck, I talked a little bit about in last week when I talked about the Avengers. Don Heck, if he's not inked by a really good inker, not so great. Really, the only person who could really ink Don Heck really good was him, at least on a consistent basis. There were a couple inkers that could do him, but really he was always best inking himself. Don Heck was hopeless when he was inking somebody else. And you get a little of that in here too. And then you get stuff like Don Heck doing breakdowns and Werner Roth doing pencils over Don Heck and having somebody else do the inking. The back half of this book, with the exception of the backup stories that were interesting in themselves and were drawn by Werner Roth, there is our title story there, Lonely Are the Hunted. And it's poor Cyclops there who is the hunted. I mean, it just isn't great. You know, they had an issue, I think, with this title at this point, where the sales just were not great. So they started messing around, I think, with the penciling, and I think that's why they had to change up on the penciling. Maybe, you know, throw Don Heck on there and see what happens. What happened was that the work wasn't that great. One of the reasons I think Don Heck left Marvel eventually is they kept putting crappy inkers on Don Heck. You have to be careful when you ink a guy like that. And the work that followed Werner Roth just was kind of substandard. And the book wasn't doing well, so they did a weird thing where they would make the X-Men logo real small and they would focus on a character in the book. And oddly enough, the character they focus on here is Magneto. So you got the power of Magneto here. So if you're just in the newsstand, that's what you think you're buying, is that Magneto comic book. I don't know why they thought somebody would want to buy a Magneto comic book at this point when he wasn't as interesting as he became later on. But you also have them focus on the Angel, and they also end up focusing on the sense-shattering Cyclops. So you know the book wasn't doing that well. And the reason the book wasn't doing that well, and I can tell you just from reading it, with the exception of the efforts by Werner Roth, the book itself wasn't as good as most other Marvel comic books at the time. It wasn't as good as the Fantastic Four. It was not as good as Spider-Man, wasn't as good as Avengers, definitely wasn't as good as Thor. It was just on the lower tier of Marvel comic books quality-wise, which is a shame because there's a lot of good ideas in this. If they would focus more on the mutant stuff and how they were the outcasts of society, hunted and feared, if they would focus on that, and if they had put a little more thought into some of the villains, which a lot of them frankly weren't that interesting. The Locust is not that interesting. They could have had something here. As it was, X-Men I probably didn't become great until much later on. Neil Adams does show up towards the end of this original X-Men run, and from what I've seen of that, those should be some good issues. I haven't actually sat down and read them. I'm looking forward to that. But this one, just okay. It's just okay. But I'm glad I read it, because this is a part of the Marvel Universe and part of comic books that I just was not, it was out of my wheelhouse. I had not read these before, is what I meant. But I was happy I read them. I was glad to make Werner Roth's acquaintance. I do appreciate the work that he put into this book. It's a funny thing about some of the things that we leave behind in this world. Most of us leave behind nothing. Most of us, once we're gone, we will be completely forgotten. Even in a couple generations, our own family won't know who we are. Who was your great-great-great-grandfather? You probably don't know. That's what I mean. That's the way it is for most of us. A few of us who have real ability, they can leave something behind. Now, Werner Roth is never going to be remembered the way Jack Kirby is remembered, or the way some of the other great comic book artists are remembered. But he will be remembered because as long as people are interested in comic books, they'll probably be interested in the X-Men, because this is a major comic book. Now, because Werner Roth was on the X-Men, people will, pretty much like I said, as long as comic books are of interest, will be reading these issues that Werner Roth did. They will continue to be reprinted just because it's the X-Men. And Werner Roth, even though he wasn't a perfect fit, at least gave it his best work. He did his best job. He put in a real effort. And it does show. So at least there's that. He could be proud of the work that he did. I mean, he's gone now and doesn't feel anything, but he could be proud of this work. And I, as a reader, appreciate the effort that he put in. Not all of this book was that much effort put into it. So this is kind of a mixed bag. So that is the X-Men. Lonely Are the Hunted. Kind of a low point for the most part. Next week we will be talking about Spider-Man. Specifically Steve Ditko's Spider-Man next week. We'll be talking about the first volume of Spider-Man. Steve Ditko, I don't know that he was the best Spider-Man artist. I think that was somebody else later on, but really interesting. And he did invent the visual world of Spider-Man. So that should be fun next week. And I will have something up later this week. I appreciate you taking your time here with me on my Comic Book Wednesday. Be sure to check out Steve Donoghue's video and see what he has to say about all this. And I will catch you next time.